Cool. So I'm just going to do a bit of a run through kind of where we've got to with resources at the moment after a few iterations. Just to kind of put on the table what we're currently thinking and start the discussion around that, because obviously I think there's going to be a lot of different opinions and ideas around this concept. Subtitle, always going to have subtitles for these talks. They're in back the end of class. So this is basically just a reference to that what you'll probably see at the end of it is we're kind of going back to a similar way that we had Azure targets. It's kind of an amalgamation of Azure targets and Azure steps in a way, but let's get into it. So the key thing is, obviously, first of all, what are we actually trying to solve? What is resources here for? Why do we start that whole process? So one of the primary things we're looking to do is provide better cloud support, working in a world where, users might not yet have their infrastructure up and running yet. And it's not something that is, might be transient and come and go, etc. And also better support for cattle, where, again, in a similar vein, and they're both kind of very interrelated. You don't really know or care how many instances of a certain thing you've got out in the world. All you know is that you've got something out there that meets some certain criteria, and you want them all to have a version of your package running. So our first pass on resources version 1, as some of you might have heard, we started thinking about resources as a first class concept, and start thinking about things from a world where the users actually think about these resources out in the world as something in their system. And I'm sure you're all thinking, yep, I've read the specs for that. I know exactly what resources is. And I think my response to that is you're lying because you didn't read the specs, and we've changed it anyway. So to go over what resources was, or what it has been in its first iteration, just so you can see how we got to where we are now. So the first idea was that we'd start thinking about steps as utilizing a resource rather than a target. So utilizing this abstract concept, we would then be able to elevate those resources and expose them to user in sort of slightly more advanced ways, rather than at the moment just through this concept of a stringly type role. We'd be able to dynamically do fancy stuff, which involve resolving machines at runtime, dealing with cloud infrastructure that doesn't yet exist. So again, because we wouldn't be using the old roles mechanism, you could set up your whole deployment structure and not even have any actual hardware ready to go yet. And so just a matter of modeling their application a bit closer to how they think of the world, rather than just in terms of processes. But, and there's a big but there, the problem was that it was a change to how users mentally map Octopus. So this would involve changing some of the fundamental concepts in Octopus in terms of the relationship between targets and deployments, and changing how they need to map all that out, and added a few extra layers of complexity to the system. There's some debate internally as to whether that view was more or less accurate. So whether or not that actually was how people modeled their processes in the real world or not, it's kind of up for discussion. And ultimately it came down to, was that more complex, flexible approach really trying to solve our core problem, or was it just trying to go over the top for something that wasn't really needed? So we took it back and started thinking about resources again, in a world where basically making that migration process and that thinking about a world where resources wasn't such a big shift to how users thought about Octopus. So a result of that, going down that path, we realized that resources was the wrong word. I think one of the biggest problems we had in all these discussions was because the word resources is such a vague kind of concept. Everyone kind of had a different idea as to what that actually represented, both to the user and to us. And I often found that we would have discussions where it felt like we all agreed on, how a screen should look or what it should do. But then we go away and have a conversation with someone and just sort of think to myself, hang on, the way you just described it doesn't quite fit how in my head I'm thinking it's modeled. So I think the word resources is a bit overloaded. So we're getting rid of the word resources. That's no longer a part of this. This whole talk is now no longer about resources. So it's more about targets. So we've still got machine targets, and nothing's changed from that. That's the same old boring machine targets that everyone knows and loves. And that's still sort of reigns supreme. You still got the roles, and the roles are on the processes. What we have done is...
I like it.
So let's see if that works. No. Let's not do that then. Maybe I'll just jump over that slide. So let's see if that works now. Okay, so one of the things we're introducing is custom targets. Now this, I just figured I'd add this as part of this discussion because it's come out of this work around resources and targets. Basically what a custom target amounts to is it's a target that the user can define where they provide a logo and a bunch of properties that you need to provide as part of that endpoint. And then when they go in and sort of define that target in their infrastructure, they would fill out those details. So the idea is it would basically replace what we now call cloud targets. Cloud regions, sorry. So it's effectively just a way of allowing users to iterate over a collection of variables, effectively, where they kind of model that how it makes sense to them. So for example, in this world, you might have a deployment step, which is hitting something in your Zero application, in the Zero web service out in the world, and you want to provide a sort of a strongly typed target that hits, so that way you can iterate over it. You can ensure you've got all the variables you need to actually connect to Zero, and you can kind of create a slightly more strongly typed world. But then more of interest to us is dynamic targets. So this it's similar in some respects to the custom target world, where it's just a collection of things that are iterated over. But the difference is this bit at the bottom, which I can't draw on, nothing's, okay. So the dynamic section there in the instances, what that's basically doing is you're defining a set of rules. And those rules are basically mapped to tags out on your infrastructure out in the world, that when a deployment takes place and you have got a step which references the role, in this case, pricing service, that role resolves to this target, which is an Azure function dynamic target. And what you're basically saying is when a deployment takes place, connect to Azure. So this is a strongly typed target again, obviously. So use these credentials, the DevOps Azure account, connect to Azure and look for any Azure functions that have these particular tags. So in this case, we've got some rule called octopus.myrule, and it's got a value called tax calculation function. And then we might have another tag, which is usage environment. And that value itself is a variable that is resolved at the time of deployment into whatever environment you're in. And that means you could have a bunch of these tax calculation function Azure functions out in your Azure subscription, and then it would use the different environments that it's being deployed to pick up the relevant ones. So the idea is that there's effectively an extra layer of indirection between the deployment and the actual things out in the world. And that is all defined through these rules, which are defined on your target. At the same time, if you want to go the pet approach, you can, instead of going dynamic, say it's a static instance, and then you get the same old autocomplete, integrated with Azure type drop down. So you can pick a specific function if you live in a pets world where you want to pick a specific resource out in your Azure world that you want to deploy to, as opposed to the dynamic side of things where it's all based on the tags and it's all done at deployment time.
So that second option there is basically the 3.0 version of Azure targets, the way Azure Web Apps and Cloud Services were previously.
Yeah, that's right. So just to kind of talk through how some of that target resolution would take place. So we've got a dynamic target here, which it's an Azure function. Let's say we've got a tag on it, which says it needs to be a tax calculator, and we provide the Azure subscription. So we've got a whole bunch of target providers in Octopus itself. So obviously we might want to deal with AWS infrastructure. We might want to deal with Azure infrastructure. And so when a deployment takes place, and it's actually a good thing to point out is it's not even necessarily when a deployment takes place, but this occurs in between each step even. So if you've got one step that provisions a whole bunch of infrastructure, when the next step takes place and this rule resolves, it might end up sucking in those newly provisioned items if they match the tags.
Can I have an Azure function on AWS?
Well, no, because what will happen is because the type itself is an Azure function, your target provider knows I can't do anything with that. You give me an Azure subscription property, I need an AWS certificate to do anything further. So you've obviously got these sort of requirements in the providers in terms of the credentials, I suppose, would be the most obvious thing, where in some cases, obviously, that AWS target provider is not really relevant anymore, or for the sake of this resolution process. So then you've got out in your Azure world, you've got two different subscriptions. You've got a bunch of Azure functions in there. And so the target provider talks to Azure. Again, that is happening as the deployment progresses. We connect into Azure, we query the Azure system, go, hey, give me your list of Azure functions, get me the tags, and here's my subscription. And we know that, okay, the subscription is prod, so obviously we don't have access to staging, so that's kind of, staging is now relevant for the purpose of this resolution. And based on the tag we provided, we're able to check it against the tags in the infrastructure out there. So the idea is these tags live out in the world. So the source of truth is the actual world itself. It's not this metadata that we keep that we've said that this Azure function has this tag or this one has these properties. And that allows you to be a little bit more flexible and dynamic in terms of what that resolves to. So going forward, the idea is that those target providers would be sort of reasonably extensible or pluggable. So that way, as we come forward and we've got new sort of cloud providers, we can just plug in these providers that all they effectively are doing is all the role that they play in a deployment is they say, the deployment says, hey, I've got this bunch of information, give me some infrastructure, give me something that I'm going to run the deployment against. And then from inside them, they decide, okay, you've got the Azure credentials, you've got the AWS credentials, whatever kind of makes sense. And they just return the information needed for Octopus to connect and run whatever deployment makes sense. Potentially, it might even make sense to have a provider there that would resolve to Octopus targets. That isn't necessarily a good thing or worthwhile doing, but the point is that we might have scenarios that we want to model where rather than resolving to a specific role and having to define those as mapping specific targets, you'd be able to do that through the more rules-based approach. So just a couple of other sort of key points around this new model. So yeah, so the key thing is this whole resources / dynamic targets approach is more about modeling your cattle, provisioning and deprovisioning, and actually setting up the infrastructure. It sort of comes under the guise of other features. So transient environments is one feature that's we'll be bringing out shortly. Or even if you have your own custom steps, like it was just demoed by Matt to provision your Azure stuff. So this is purely about sort of the modeling side of things and setting up your deployments so they can pull in what they need more so than actually setting up what you need. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, the tags and everything lives in the real world. The source of truth is out there in AWS. And tags will potentially work both ways. So we might provide the ability for things like in service messages to set tags on a resource. So you might want to do things like have a deployment process where you've got the blue-green deployments where you might have two Azure functions, one which is tagged with blue, one which is tagged with green. And when the deployment takes place, a step kicks in that basically swaps those tags around on the infrastructure so that next time that you run, it'll sort of, flip-flop back and forth as makes sense. As we actually resolve these targets, the other thing is we pull out a whole bunch of information that makes sense for that target type. So for example, for the Azure Cloud Service, it might make sense to pull back all this extra metadata like IP address or DNS entry, etc. So that way you can pass it to load balancers or do something with them in the subsequent steps. So they're a source of variables as well as a something that uses variables, I suppose. And I think that sums it up. So that's a fairly high, brief level run through as to how the dynamic targets work in the new world and how that kind of allows us to map to sort of a slightly more cattle cloud approach. Yeah, so I think that we'll probably do a Friday feature discussion again to go through, because I imagine that people have got some questions and comments. Are there any questions and comments?
Got two. When you say tags, are these the same kind of tags we use for tenants at the moment?
No, so it's much more sort of key value type approach. There's not tag types. There's not. It's just a.
Yeah, it's the tags concept that exists in Azure and AWS.
Yeah. And the other one was for the your example with 0.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw there were variables, so those would contribute to. So you'd have a target per environment. So you could have username, that'd be a variable. So you could substitute that into your config file, for example.
So you would probably get that property called, so it might be, let's say, it might be exposed via octopus.target.username or something like that you could then use in your deployment.
Yeah. Okay, so then you can
okay.
map that to another variable to substitute to your file.
Sorry?
Then you can map that to another variable to substitute.
Right.
Because what
Sure.
I'm saying is you could set up your username and password for your 0, and then you want that to go into your web config file.
Yep.
Yeah, which feels like this is more an account, this example.
Well, it's not an account, because account is something that you kind of use in a deployment. These are more allowing you to have that bundle of properties that you want to sort of iterate over, because they make sense as a sort of a self-contained.
Yeah,
It's a sense of
which is confusing to me as calling it
Yeah.
target, because is 0 actually a deployment target here, or is it just an input variable values?
Well, they're kind of both, right? It's both. I mean, it's well, and
But nothing will ever execute on it. So it's like a cloud region. It will execute on the server in the scope of that target.
Oh, okay.
So you would, if you had multiple of those in your environment, you could iterate over them, but it's
it runs on the server effectively.
Oh, okay.
It's not. We don't do anything to it. So the custom targets, all custom targets are pretty much run on the server. It's just that when we run on the server, we've got all these variables we can do something with, and so if I've got 2 of these, I might have 2 0 endpoints in staging, one for payroll and one for something else.
So this is more for I want to do something with the 0 API.
correct. Exactly.
Yeah. So what happened to the concept of where we can model APIs and that sort of thing for variables?
Are you talking more about more strongly typed variable types? Is that?
Yeah, we were originally talking about I've got like a test, dev, and production API with several properties on it. Like say Facebook login, it's got 3 properties.
Well, that's exactly what you use this for. So
No, well, you can't, because you need to target your step towards that API. But if all you want to do is use it as variables in your config transfer.
So
Oh,
there
I
is.
see,
So
I
there is the whole discussion that Michael has started putting around about more strongly typed variables. If that's where you get to define effectively a variable type, and it doesn't play a role as a target. It's purely it's sucked in at deployment time.
Actually, that makes a lot more sense. Actually,
Yeah, the variable is the target, and then you can refer to it.
Correct.
Yeah.
The point is these provide a mechanism to sort of allow you to iterate over.
these are
it
really
would be
great.
nice if it was a space level, because of several projects. I guess you could use the local set variable sets.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
I have
it's not
another
a simple
question, because you said that these are like generic things that you can just define, but they have a type, right? You know that it's a web app.
Yes. So you
No.
so you can make the custom target type.
The custom targets don't have a type.
Well, yes, they would. They would. So the idea is that I, as a producer of the 0 step type, might define. Okay, I've got my step type, which is I'm going to go and hit the 0 endpoint and do some sort of calculation. And as someone who builds that, I might say in the manifest, and that step type requires this type of target. So you can declare that and make it sort of a first class thing.
It has to be as well, because you can't declare a web app as your web app without an account. So the account
So that becomes more of a dynamic. So that would be a world more like this.
is because the static thing over there isn't just one drop down, it's actually an account that gets you to a drop down.
Sure.
So these are more complicated than just a key value pair.
We'll add the Azure and AWS types in though ourselves as proper first class target types. The custom ones are ones that a user can create themselves.
Okay, so the users can create them.
Yeah. So the way to think of it is this. So the way to think is these custom targets are just kind of like a one-to-one. When a deployment runs and it runs in one place, it runs in the context of a target on a server. Whereas the dynamic targets are kind of like a one-to-many, or allow you to do more of a one-to-many type approach, where you provide a set of rules that gets resolved when deployment takes place. And that might turn into, you might have 5 different endpoint services that get deployed to. Or
So it might be a good thing to think of it more like as current machines and tentacles and SSH targets at the moment, that certain steps can only run on certain targets. Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
Rob,
yes.
two questions. Firstly, in terms of the dynamic resolution of targets, is there a possibility if you have a sequence of steps to be run in order, like 1, 2, 3, that by the time step 3 resolves that there's new infrastructure that didn't receive steps 1 and 2? Or is there a mechanism protecting around that?
There's new infrastructure that, okay, I see what you're saying.
Just from like a synchronicity point of view.
Yeah, sure. I don't see why we couldn't put in the ability to say, no, these steps are required to be run, but basically say, I need them all to be run or whatever.
Yeah, and so then it would only resolve at the start.
If each, I think I understand what Andrew's saying, if each step is resolving the targets.
Yeah, I'm saying there's, if you do it, so for some people that makes perfect sense because that's what they want to do. But for other people,
No, that's what you don't want to do.
You do that, Charles.
So step 1 runs and you've got 2 machines. By the time step 3 runs, there's 4 machines because you've got stuff spinning up.
Sure.
So you run step 4 on those 2 machines that didn't have step 1 run on it. And things
So for a scenario where you've got step 1 does something, step 2 is provision more of that something.
No. Just outside of the process altogether, there's infrastructure coming up that happens.
Right. Okay. So again, so that's what I was saying. Where to me that's more of a project kind of concern because that might make sense or it might not.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's necessarily something we would dictate and say that no, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
No, I agree. It might be worth having an option to make a series of steps atomic, though, to say run these in order, on whatever's available at the first step, and then you kind of lock the dynamic resolution.
So those also be tied to the parent step, and you do child steps or something like that.
Yeah. Because at the moment,
new machines, you might be looking for new stuff and explicit opt-in there.
like we do with health check. At the moment, if new machines get added during the deployment, they won't get included in the deployment.
Yeah, sure. the whole point of this though is that
it's more about
hang on. The determining targets up front is the whole thing that this is trying to get rid of.
Oh yeah, no, but we determine the targets at the first step.
At the moment, we do, but this is
and then we run through. If new things come online, we don't add them to the deployment unless you run a health check step. Then we add them, right? So the person's got to be explicit about adding new things into the deployment.
Or you have, down the bottom of your step, there's the option of, run condition and all that. One of those could be,
I need to have been run on
target, obtain targets, and it's like, before this step or before step X or
reevaluate targets.
I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that.
Yeah, so if this is a new, instead of a health check step, do a resolve target step or re-resolve targets.
I don't like having to add an extra whole step just for something like that. Like to me, a condition, something on the step itself sounds like it's...
Yeah, but it's more explicit. Anyway, it's more design, but it's more explicit from a user point of view. And looking at the logs, you can see at this point, I know it's going to resolve.
Or you can tag a step as, affecting targets for later steps. Because you're going to write a step that spins up new infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you can explicitly say this step creates new infrastructure.
Yeah, it's one of the options at the bottom of a step. Flag.
It's just, I guess go through all the things and see which ends up being the best for the code.
Yeah, the point is more about providing that ability.
Health check step.
Like
it gives us a synchronization point in parallelism and all that sort of stuff.
The other question / comment, kind of representing team $, bill. In terms of spinning up these custom targets and dynamic targets, even though the modeling is really, like going back to your custom targets example of 0, it's nice to be able to model that as a target and then, ping it with like an API update or something. But from a pricing point of view, because we've modeled the pricing on number of targets now, we may find that that comes at quite a cost from a licensing model.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So one thing I didn't mention is that in these discussions, when it comes to licensing, the thing we figured that would make sense to begin with is that licensing would still just affect normal existing targets. So these custom targets probably won't be factored into that at the moment.
Because I think we've tried to keep our messaging consistent when customers have asked about things like Azure and AWS and say, look, we don't count them now, but we might later.
Yep.
So there's obviously scope for that. But I just thought, it might create a world where you want to strongly model everything as best you can, but suddenly where you were only using 3 or 4 targets before, now you have 40, and suddenly your spend is, 10 times.
Yep, that makes sense. Good question.
But you would have one dynamic target here if that amounted to 40 things.
On the other hand, we want to get paid, right? So
Yeah.
if someone's 100% in AWS deploying to 10,000 machines, but saying 2 dynamic targets.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the other things that has been floated around is the idea that when it comes to the Azure side of things, obviously at the moment Azure is free, but I think eventually we'll probably get to a point where the charge is based on what you're deploying to. So if you got a dynamic target that resolves to 10 endpoints, then there'd be some sort of pricing that factors that in. But obviously that's a whole licensing pricing discussion for later on.
We talked about using a high watermark. So, whatever your peak number of targets in any given month is, that's kind of where your pricing sits. But in this dynamic scenario, you might find that you deploy 5 times to dynamic functions, which have changed each time. So it's counted them 5 times, even though it's the same one being spun up and torn down with different IDs and stuff. So yeah, we might have to have a bit of a think about that.
Yeah. So for the first off the bat pass of this, these dynamic targets and custom targets probably won't impact your licensing
Free.
at all. It's free, which is no different from at the moment.
Just
Right?
like today, I think cloud region targets aren't counted in your licensing.
Yeah, it's just machines, I think, just like number of machines, that's it. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, done. Yeah. So that's the thing, this is kind of helping to set the groundwork for when you want to start using transient environments and have that process where things spin up. And I mean, again, I'd imagine that there'd be some sort of hook into this dynamic target stuff with the existing subscription or the existing process we've got around when machines come online, redeploy to them, et cetera, et cetera. Because again, there's no reason you couldn't evaluate this outside of the context of a deployment. So you might want to evaluate, well, what is the actual set of machines that I get in staging right now, given these particular rules?
I think it's cool. I think it makes good sense moving forward with hosted as well, because we're moving towards a scenario where what you've set up with Octopus is going to be a lot more decoupled from what you've set up from an infrastructure point of view. So it leaves them both a little bit more fluid, I think, which is cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all this probably will take a little while to just kind of sink in and you start thinking about all the different, I imagine everyone's cogs and gears in your head are all probably all turning, thinking about all the different ways this either does work or doesn't work, etc. So I'll shoot around the link to the specs that kind of outline some of this again, just so you can have a bit of read through. And then we can have another meeting on Friday to go through some of the discussion points that come out of that.
Cool.
Sorry, I missed the pretty thing in there before. I see the environments issued everything about the scoping.
Cool.